All right, it's time to start. Welcome to UTA at IETF 114. Your chairs, one of which is on site and the other is remote. Marie, my co-chair, is right there.
Hi.
Very good. So with the usual reminders of note well, please note the note well, and also the IETF code of conduct. That's, well, be nice to each other, speak clearly at the mic, and stick to the topic at hand. It's one way of expressing it. And for this meeting, mask is required in the meeting room. With that, we have a reasonably full agenda today. There's a lot of stuff to cover. We do need a couple of note takers. We need a normal note taker, and if possible, somebody to go watch Zulip and channel any discussions to the mic. That can't be anyone who can't sort of be either remote or using voice remote or in person. So can we get some volunteers to all right, so Valerie's taking care of Zulip, but we do need a note taker. Oh, perfect, Ben, thank you. So Ben Schwartz like volunteered to take notes. This is really good. All right, with that, here's our agenda today. We are going to start with Rich. Who's going to talk to us about the IP address issue, and then Hannes to talk about IoT. And I see Hannes here already. Joe, I haven't seen Joe online. Oh, there you are. Perfect. Right. So we actually have everybody here that needs them here. So Rich, do you want to get going? I'm gonna see if, do you want to do this or should I? Okay, let me. All right. Let's see if I can make this work. There we go.
Okay. Hi, I'm going to leave after my session, not because my ego's so big, but because I think there's a conflict. Okay, next slide. All right, so like 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, Martin Thompson proposed that we add support for IP addresses. There he is. The subject alt name extension in PKIX has a type for IP addresses. Obviously, to call it is IP-ID, similar to DNS ID and the other terminology used in 6125 and 6125 bis. RFC 9110, which was presumably Martin's justification for bringing it up, has text about validation. The rule is very simple. A reference ID matches if the IP address matches. Fairly straightforward. It's not uncommon in HTTP. If you've ever typed, HTTP://127.0.0.1, you've done it. Presumably, there's more mechanisms that are going to come. HTTP alternate service and some of the other mechanisms that are being added to HTTP are more likely to include more of these kinds of things. And there may even be other uses outside of HTTP. I don't know. Next slide. Okay, so the issues. It is admittedly late. Martin said so in his comment. It might make the draft more widely applicable. I don't know. I'll take him at his word. The simple wording change does have ripple effects through the document. For example, in the front, near the front of the doc, it says, here's the rules, boom, 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 boom. And then you have to add like an escape hatch for step 3 that says, but if it's an IP address, do this. It's just editorial wordsmithing. So the goal is we should want to seek working group consensus whether or not to do this. It wasn't clear if there was consensus. Chairs thought there was. I thought there was. No, we're not quite right. There's an initial PR. I reopened the PR on the issue. It's on GitHub. So the PR is by Martin, admittedly incomplete. The issue about doing it is there. Not in the bullet list, but probably worth noting is I'm going to be kind of busy with NomCom for the next 5 months. So, but I have a co-author, a little bit busy. I'm just going to pick all the old incumbents and do them again. Anyhow, next slide. So the current text in the out of scope section, which this obviously would go away, is identifiers such as IP addresses are not discussed. Protocols other than HTTP may want to consider, and then points to 9001, 9000 something, as a validation model. I think that's reasonable description of the issues. Looking for, what the working group wants to do.
So with my chair hat, how much is this going to screw us over in terms of timeline?
I'm complaining. It's probably not a lot of work to do all the wordsmithing necessary.
Okay. So it's more like it's your availability that's really sort of.
Yeah, and even then, I'm still just complaining. So it's probably not going to add much elapsed time. We could probably still be done before the next IETF.
So you're complaining a little bit, but not too much.
I'm complaining a little bit, not too much. Peter Andre is also available. So yeah.
Alessandro Gadini, Cloudflare. We do have, use cases for HTTPS and other secure TLS connections to IP addresses specifically. For example, the Cloudflare resolver with the 1.1.1.1 address. So ideally, I would want to see this supported. I can help with, review PRs and whatnot.
Yeah, Martin Thompson, out of the queue now. I put that pull request together, and I do sort of appreciate where you're coming from, Rich, after having tried that. It is a little bit more work than simply just adding sort of one bullet point and removing the "we don't do IPs" from the front matter. It's not my document, so I wasn't able to identify everything, I don't think, very confidently. But I think probably the most interesting aspect of this is the section that talks about, which one was it? The SANS, or like not SANS, the SRV or something along those lines, where it gets a little complicated.
Is about service identifiers, right? SIP : foo, SIP s : foo.bar.
Yeah,
example.
And some of that was a little fiddly, but other than that, the changes are pretty straightforward. They're what you would imagine goes in here. So hopefully what I've got there would be enough to get you 90% of the way. Unfortunately, the last 10% is always the hardest part.
Take the other 90%.
I am kind of asking you to do it.
Yeah.
To some extent, HTTP already has what it needs, but I don't think the text in RFC 9110 is particularly good. Now that I've looked at it again, I'm sort of looking at it going, oh, gee, we could have done a better job with that. And this document here is that much better job.
Okay.
So like others, I think the work is worth doing, even if it means one more cycle and a little bit of complication. I'm happy to help. I tried to help, but that's about the extent of my ability, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Because you know the document better than I do.
Sure. Yeah, I don't want to overstate. I don't want to sound like a grumpy old man, so I don't want to overstate my concerns about it. I'm really, whatever the working group wants is fine, I should also mention we're about to submit a draft that shows how to use IP addresses in SNI fields. So.
Oh, yeah, that'll be a fun conversation.
.inatter ARPA.
Oh, no.
So.
All right. So quick sense of the room. And I'll use the hand raising tool if people really want me to, but otherwise I just sort of do it this way. In this room.
Sorry,
well,
please. A message from Alexei Melnikov in the chat. So he thinks that this problem should be addressed, but not in this document.
Alexei is right behind you in the queue. I'm sure. Go ahead, Alexei. Alexei, do you want to make a case for a separate document?
Yeah, hello. Sorry. I think the properties are slightly different, so it would be nice, probably, I think it would be better to have a separate document for this, just to keep it clean.
So are you volunteering to write one?
I don't actually mind helping out, yes.
Can you repeat that?
You didn't mind helping, yes.
Don't mind helping, yeah, because so I would actually don't want the working group to block on this, right? So if we want to sort of either proceed with like a clear commitment from authors to kind of come back with a separate document, or like we proceed with this PR, or we decide that this is not worth working on at all. So I don't want us to hang in limbo here. So Martin, you want to?
Yeah, I want to ask Alexei why, because I think the why is more important here at this point than just saying this one or the other one. Alexei?
Well, I think your comments about certain things wouldn't apply to IP addresses. It just makes me concerned. And if it doesn't fit quite right, just make it a separate document. So
Have you looked at the
the
changes
working
I
group should
proposed?
probably separately ask whether we should work on this and how it's done.
So have you looked at the changes that I proposed?
I haven't quite caught up with this, to be honest, but I will do.
Yeah, so the reason that I think this document is a better place for that, aside from having everything in the one place, is a nice and one-stop shop for people who are looking to reference these things, is that there are some interactions with the existing things, and that was the complicated part of getting the work done. It's not super complicated or anything, but having an extra document that comes in and surgically amends the various pieces of an existing document to put IP addresses in there is somewhat more complicated than I think getting it done here now that the patient's open. So that's where I ended up once I did the work. That's all.
Okay, yeah, my apologies. I haven't reviewed your PR yet, so maybe I can commit to doing it within the next 2 days or something like that.
All right. Does anybody feel strongly against progressing with PR 54?
What was the strongly against progressing with what?
Progressing with PR 54. Your pull request.
Oh.
Right.
If Alexei can get his document done, and it's, I mean, I've sort of come around to Martin's viewpoint.
Right. Victor.
Hi. Are there name constraint issues that perhaps would add some complexity for IP ID? Do we have a specification for IP ID name constraint processing? And also, does that live here, or would that be 5280 and refinements?
So the doc right now talks not at all about name constraints, which I think are kind of horked anyway, right? So presumably it would be 5280 bis, which is never going to happen. So yeah, I mean, no, I don't know if there's nothing workable about name constraints for IP addresses that I can recall, but that I may be wrong.
So the answer there is that there are no name constraints defined for IP addresses, nor do I expect there to ever be, given Rich's point about 5280 being set in stone in a way that I think is probably not a bad thing entirely.
maybe, if Alexi wants to do his draft and thinks he can get it done in a short term, then we can maybe decide. But on the other hand, I'm willing to, if the working group wants to do it, I'm willing to do it. I just don't promise anything before 115, maybe a month before.
I mean, I've heard people stand up and say that they volunteer to work on it, which is a good thing, right?
Yeah.
So it's an indication we can get it done.
Yeah, so I was going to suggest that, let's not expect Rich to do all of the work. I think Peter was interested in spending a little bit of time on this. The editors can collab. If they want to ask me to do something, I'm willing to do that. If Alexi reaches a different conclusion and wants to propose an alternative way, once he's had a look at it, if anyone else wants to do the same, we can do that. But that's
Okay.
I think at this point, I'd propose we leave it with the editors to sort through what's there. And if we get more feedback about it from people who have committed to review, then we'll discuss that.
I think that's an excellent idea. Right?
Yeah.
Let's do that and then continue this, confirm on the list.
Okay.
All right, and please, people who have stood up and said that they want to, that they are volunteering to review the current pull request or contribute other material. Let's try to get that done as quickly as possible so we can get the ball rolling.
Yeah, one thing I'll mention is if you haven't, please read the current draft, because I think it's, maybe I have an inflated opinion to myself, but it's pretty clear and simple about how to do things, which is important, I think, for the community. And so then when we do add IP addresses, we want to make sure that we don't lose that clarity and simplicity more than we have to. Okay.
I've got somebody at the queue. Is Eric? I think you want to talk about name constraints, so maybe.
Yeah, just briefly, I looked yesterday at 5280, and it does define name constraints for IP addresses. There are like other gaps with search and IP addresses that we someday we'll want to deal with, but name constraints at least does seem to be in 5280.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, but as I think you pointed out, name constraints is a bigger issue. It's not covered at all right now.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
All right.
Thank
I think
you.
that's it for your slot. Let's see here. Next on our agenda, IoT profile. Hannes.
Okay. So I would like to talk about the update we made with 05. First, I want to go through some of the changes that were made, and then to point to a couple of the open issues, of which there are a number of them in the GitHub repository of the working group. Next slide. Okay. So the first one is, so as you know, in TLS 1.3, to use the zero RTD feature, you have to come up with an application-specific profile to describe how you deal with sort of the needed replay protection. And so in an earlier document, we added that feature, and then also did sort of discuss this and announce it on the co-op list where it was actually debated. And it turned out that the core working group right now doesn't see interest in or need for the zero RTD feature in TLS for some of their uses. So with that in mind, we decided to take it out from this document and actually park it into a separate specification. That may be just temporarily, or people are just happy with the way TLS is, because there are obviously some ups and downs of using the zero RTD feature. So that's where we are today, at least. So it's not gone forever, but at least for now. So that makes the document shorter. So that's a plus, because you need to define a couple of additional co-op options to make that feature work. Okay. The other one, which is a little bit more tricky, is the recommendation on the deterministic ECDSA, which we sort of took over from the previous TLS and DTLS 1.2 IoT recommendations, as well as from what the TLS 1.3 specification says. So the recommendation there is to use deterministic ECDSA, and
But then it seems that the sort of focus or the excitement has changed again in terms of that feature, and there are obviously currently discussion in CFRG on adding the noise or randomness back into the ECDSA function, as you will see on the next slide. But the point here is that there are attacks, and specifically exploiting the weakness that that random number generation is, of course, a challenging topic on IoT devices and non-IoT devices, specifically if you have access to those devices and you can mount fault injection attacks. Of course, IoT devices are often, or the attacker often has physical access, so those attacks would be applicable. And even though we see an increase in sort of hardware-based features for security, including random number generation, there is at least a perception that those are not as good as they could be, which I don't want to quantify because it's obviously depends on from product, or I'm sure that the features vary from product to product, so I don't want to make a general statement, but at least if you look at those attacks, there are cases where devices have had limited randomness in, and obviously that when applied to some of our protocols and also the signature mechanisms, that causes problems. What I personally, on the next slide, I struggle then with is to actually make good recommendations, because even a protocol like DLS, we need sources of randomness in various places. And for example, not just with ECDSA, but also with the ephemeral Diffie-Hellman, or with the randomness that is sent around in a client hello server hello exchange. But in my belief, if you don't have any randomness, then you set yourself up for problems. But what should the recommendations be in that case? And so Thomas, who is also working on a generic UTA DLS 1.3 recommendation document, which is sort of separate from the IoT recommendation, there are some recommendations being made which are now sort of carried over into this document. So it's easy to write those recommendations. In some sense, it's another story to actually implement them in real hardware and real software on IoT devices. But I think that's as much as we can do at this point in time. Okay. Thanks to Michael Richardson. I don't see him right now in the room, but he has done a very detailed review in response to a presentation I gave at the IoT Ops meeting at the last IETF. And this is one that we addressed already. It's one that concerns the use of intermediate CA versus subordinate CA, which we were a little bit relaxed on using the terminology from RC 4949. So we addressed that one. As you will see later, he had a couple of other reviews which we addressed already, but he didn't indicate whether he is happy with them. So we didn't incorporate them into the document, waiting for his final assessment before we are going to do that. Next slide. Okay. So there are a few open issues. One is what we call the feature disparity and that was also discussed on the DLS mailing list, not just on the UTA list, is with certain features that they are different between 1.2 and 1.3, which are kind of subtle. For example, on the slide, this concerns the renegotiation, which apparently some people used in DLS 1.2 to check the certificate status at a later stage. So for long-lived DLS connections, they are apparently, which are used in industrial IoT networks, they use that technique to find out whether the certificate is still valid using, for example, OCSP extensions carried inside that exchange, or just triggering a certificate checking again. we went through the discussions on the TLS list and tried to capture some of it in this issue that is linked here. But it's not so easy to really make a recommendation on what to do about some of those different features. Clearly, renegotiation is gone, but should there be some extensions being added back to TLS to enable some of those features, or is the solution that has been used actually not the right approach to begin with? And that's specifically on that front, the long-lived TLS connections and using that the renegotiation feature to check the status of certificates. Is that actually the best way to do? I'm not sure. In either case, the TLS extension is not something that we can incorporate, or new extension incorporate into this document anyway. And for the other one, it's, even if we make that recommendation, those who relied on that feature previously are going to change their code to make use of it. Not entirely certain. Martin?
Yeah, Hannes, have you considered the use of the exported authenticators for this purpose?
Actually, no. How would that work?
So it would require something at the application layer, but you would essentially have one side challenge the other side to present an exported authenticator, and you would that other side would then produce what is effectively a certificate and a signature using that certificate over something exported from the various secrets. And that would allow you to refresh your view of the currency of the certificate that was used on the connection. Maybe you don't need to provide a certificate, you just provide the authenticator. But
okay,
that's recently
published. That's an interesting approach. I don't think that was actually proposed on the list. I went through the discussions and don't think I saw that one. It's probably worthwhile to explore whether it was Steffen Fries from Siemens who brought this up, because he is working deeply on this industrial IoT use cases. And so I will definitely double check.
There's a number of things you can do that might help. So the rekeying that happens, the key updates, allow you to refresh keys and give you some degree of post-compromise security, but this would allow you to refresh the credentials. What you don't get is fresh entropy for the session. So you don't get the ability to do another Diffie-Hellman, for instance. That may actually be a feature from the IoT perspective, I don't know. Discuss it. I don't know what the right answer is.
There's probably probably what we would need is almost like a problem statement with assumptions to find out like what specific attacks do we care about, and do we care about like what keys are we expecting to double check whether they are compromised? Is it a long-term key? Is it something like, if we do a key update, for example, clearly we wouldn't recognize whether the certificates used in a mutual TLS exchange have been compromised, and so on and so on.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's sounds like a good idea to actually use that example as a trigger to debate what exactly the requirements are.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to go about it.
Yeah, I like that.
We have one more person in the queue behind Martin.
Oh,
assuming about the
yeah,
same thing.
Steffen, actually, cool. Hey, Steffen.
Hi, Hannes. Good to see you. Yeah, just to shed some light on the requirement. So the requirement goes back to one of the TLS usages that we have in power system automation. And there it is a way that currently we used in the renegotiation feature in TLS 1.2 to trigger the certificate revocation check, as Hannes mentioned. And while switching over to TLS version 1.3, we would basically offload that functionality to the application itself, because there is no trigger coming from the TLS stack, because renegotiation is no longer allowed in TLS version 1.3. So that means that we basically have some kind of timer in the application, and once the timer is up, the certificate gets rechecked. We can do the key update in TLS 1.3 using the post handshake messages, but the certificate check would still need to be done. And in TLS 1.3, we had the possibility to basically take the certificate that comes out of the handshake and then give it up to the application, and the application can do the revocation check again. Now we essentially have to store the certificate in the application to ensure that after a certain time we can recheck the certificate regarding its revocation state. So that was the basic requirement there. And the requirement comes from the fact that once in a while, the certificate for long, I'm sorry, the certificate for long-lived connection is required to be checked for its revocation state to ensure that it is still valid while the session is running.
Thanks, Stefan. Yeah, that was good background. So we obviously have to.
Victor, do you want to?
Victor de Harvey, Google. I have a question for Stefan, actually. Why, or rather, what threats, if you could explain on list, or if not now, do we want to know whether the certificate is expired given the session's already established? It would be good to know what the actual reason is beyond just doing the thing we've been doing.
No, we can't hear you.
Stefan, you're mute.
No.
No, not yet.
Feels like a local mute rather than a. Now you're Meet Echo muted.
Test.
Yeah. Nothing.
It just worked, so that's mysterious.
It just worked. Yes. No.
I think he's trying to get away not answering that question. That's cheap, Stefan.
All right.
He could at least hear my joke. That's good.
Yeah. Stefan, you want to come back to this in a minute or two, and then you can type it into the chat. Hannes has a few slides to go, so we can loop back to this.
Yeah, so in any case, regardless of what the conclusion is, we need to sort of like say I think we need to say something in a document and explain, like, for those who have been using TLS 1.2, what that means in 1.3 as they move over. Okay, next one. So this is the one I mentioned previously. There were two items, client certificate validation and also SNI hiding, which are two separate issues waiting for Michael's input. Won't go into those. The details are obviously in the item. I would ping him during this week, so hopefully he has some cycles. And the other one, one other issue or two other issues are related to profiling of timers. That's something we did in the previous profile for 1.2 when we noticed that the use of DTLS, this is a DTLS feature, the default recommendations for the timeouts were not really adequate for some of the IoT networks, specifically mesh networks, which have a high latency and potentially high loss rate. And so we went through a long effort to sort of adjust those timers. Of course, the 1.3 is a little different, so we have to figure out what the timers are. And then also with the RRC, sort of the checking or the document that we've been working on in the TLS working group to do the checking needed for the path validation for the connection ID changes. So, of course, anyone who has experience with using DTLS and specifically 1.3 for some of those networks, we're happy to hear your experience. Okay.
That's it,
I think that's it.
Last slide. All right. So we're looking at a couple of more iterations before we're ready to shepherd.
At least definitely one to address those comments as you like. It's we're getting down to sort of coming to the end on this.
Yeah. Okay. So all right. All right. Thank you. All right. And that gets us to Joe. Let's see if I can. No, didn't want to share. Let's try that. Here we go. Back to syslog.
All right.
Yay.
Yes, back to syslog again. So you can go to the next slide. Yeah, this just is a document that Chris and Sean and I are working on. The kind of summary here is this has recently been adopted as a working group item, which is fantastic. We're basically updating cipher suites and transport protocol for these various RFCs. And really what prompted this was the IEC TC57 WG15 group was referencing these specs, and the specs reference some older cipher suites and TLS versions, which in order to be compliant with the specs, they would have to implement the old things. They don't want to do that, obviously, for good reason. So we're we fixed up these particular problems in the 00 draft by specifying modern cipher suite to be used and recent versions of TLS, including TLS 1.3. Next slide. The only major change in the 01 draft is around 0 RTT. We decided that we shouldn't use 0 RTT with, and we should be explicit about it with syslog. Syslog doesn't really have a replay protection. And in many cases, 0 RTT, it's not really, we didn't feel that this would be a very widely used feature either, because connections tend to be long-lived. So we say must not use early data. Next slide. So we've already published -01, so we'd love to get some more review. So folks, if you could give us a little bit of review, then we can take that to hopefully working group last call soon.
Yeah, I mean, it's fairly, not a lot of complexity here, so should be possible, right? So can I get a indication, raise hands or hums or something from people who have read this draft? Fair number. Can I get a few of you to say, yes, I will review this, so we can get Victor, Hannes, right? Right. That's good. So we can get Victor and Hannes on the record having volunteered to review. That sort of gets us that much closer to working group last call and like Shepherd. That's very good.
Okay.
All right.
Great.
I think that's
Thanks.
it. Which gets us to open mic for this meeting. And if nobody has anything, well, maybe something.
Ben Schwartz. On the topic of IP address identities and certificates, I wanted to mention that the ADD working group has run into an interesting situation where it would be very convenient if there were a way to mint a certificate that claims all the IP addresses in a subnet. So, so that somebody who, for example, an ISP that owns a wide IP range could have a certificate that says, yes, I am willing and able to terminate traffic for all of the identities in this, all the IP address identities in this range. Currently, I think there's no way to spell that. So anyway, if anybody's interested in talking about that that use case, which is related to encrypted DNS on IPv6 home gateways, talk to me.
And this is related to public suffix list stuff, right?
So the motivation, to briefly, the motivation is that the ADD DDR mechanism, if the home gateway's DNS server is identified by a public address, like a public IPv6 address, as opposed to a link local address, then the encrypted DNS server must present a certificate that covers that IPv6 address. And so if an ISP wanted to operate an encrypted DNS service for all of its users, then in this configuration, they would, first of all, per Eric's comment, they would need some way in the SNI to find out which IP address the client is trying to find a substitute for. And secondly, they would need separate certificates for every single IP address of every single DNS resolver in all of their customers' home gateways, instead of one big certificate that just says, I claim the entire IP range.
Okay.
Anyway, this is not something that's possible today. It would be an entirely new identifier format for X509.
Victor? Yes.
Hi, Victor Duchovny. I have a question, I guess, for the working group in terms of where to propose something. I'd like to, I think, have possibly an extension for a TLS client to tell the server to solicit its certificate. Because as we know, TLS client certificates are optional. If the server doesn't ask for them, the client can't present them. And yet some servers, for interoperability reasons, prefer not to ask for them by default. If a client knows that it is desirable to present a certificate, but the server is likely not to solicit them by default, there could be a need for a message for a client to say, hi, I have a certificate in the client hello or somewhere early on, without disclosing much detail about it, because the privacy issues until it goes into certificate extensions in TLS 1.3 and is encrypted. So I'd like there to be an early message to say, please grab my certificate. I'm interested for this in email, where I could do it in an ESMTP hello, but it kind of seems like the wrong layer. Should I take this to the TLS working group, to Utah? Should I just do it in the ESMTP, which unasks the question, but kind of does it at the wrong layer? Any thoughts or comments?
It's a perfect question to bounce right over to our AD. Yes. You were hoping not to be involved today. I can see that.
So I have sad news for you. I'm not the Cognizant AD. I'm just a spectator.
Oh,
today.
man.
I'm sorry.
Damn it.
But if we repeat it, I'm happy to
All right.
proxy.
So the question is, where do extensions to TLS go that could be applicable to specific application domains?
Yeah, right. I mean, that would be exactly kind of my first question. I would have to take, I mean, I think not I would, but the responsible entity would have to take a look at the charter in this working group. It would make sense.
Well, I think it makes sense for it to be here, but also it makes sense for it to be in a bunch of other places. So
absolutely. I mean,
yeah.
I think it's hard to have a universal answer to that.
Yeah.
Would be my personal opinion.
I was just going to say, there's nothing stopping someone in any working group here or even groups outside of the IETF from defining TLS extensions. That's not the problem. The problem, I think, it would be the charter of this group, which I think probably maybe doesn't include the ability to do that without a rechartering. But if this is the right place to do it, I think we should just tweak the charter and make it happen.
Yeah, personal opinion, I've always understood this working group to be kind of a catch-all, a last resort. There's no place else to do it. There's clearly a pile of expertise here. Let's leverage that expertise for expediency.
Yeah, we're certainly a group that's had a life expectancy far beyond sort of the initial set of best practice documents that I think people were envisioning. I would encourage you to write something up, draft up and present it, and we can talk about adoption here or in the whatever working group makes sense. So you know, personally, I think it sounds interesting too. So. All right. Going. Oh. Oh, well, Martin is on the queue, but I think you were, yeah. So last call for open mic time. Going once, going twice. All right, see you in London. Bye-bye. Sorry for screwing with you.
No, that's what I'm here for. I was just going to say, Francesca,
Yeah, I kind of. This was more like a security issue. That's why.